Hallo zusammen, willkommen zum zweiten von zwei unserer Interviews zum Interplay-Adventure-Rollenspiel Neuromancer. Dieses Interview haben wir geführt mit dem Programmierer des Spiels, Troy Miles, einer der ersten Mitarbeiter von Interplay und wichtigster Mann hinter diesem Spiel. Das Interview führte ich auf Englisch mit ihm, aber es gibt wie gewohnt auch eine deutsche Zusammenfassung am Ende. Die kommt dieses Mal von Gunnar. Wer direkt dorthin springen möchte, kann das mit den Kapitelmarken machen. Dann viel Spaß euch mit diesem Gespräch mit Troy Miles.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
Hello everyone, as we are wrapping up our series on Neuromancer, it's time to talk to one of the creators of the game. And I am very happy that joining me today is Troy Miles, the man who programmed Neuromancer and got top billing for it in the game's manual and on the game's title screen. So this sounds like exactly the right person to pose all of our questions to. Troy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So before we dive into all things Neuromancer, I'm curious to learn how you came to join Interplay. You were one of the very first employees, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I was. Brian Fargo and I, and Brian is the main guy from Interplay, he's an awesome dude. We had met maybe 2 years earlier at a game show that was being held up here in Orange County, California. We kept in touch. For a while, he was still working at a company called Boone. I went up there and kind of hung out with him for a day, and that was interesting, but I didn't see any sort of magic there. And then maybe a few months after that, he went out on his own and started Interplay and asked if I wanted to join. And I was like, yeah, let's do this. And that was back in '84. So that was quite some time ago.
And what were you doing at the time?
At that time, I was doing games, but I was just doing games by myself. And so a lot of these, especially in the Commodore family and even some of the early Apple IIs, there wasn't a lot of software, especially for Commodores. I initially started off with the VIC-20, and then I got the C64, and I was just making games, basically copies of arcade games, and then selling them to local computer stores. And for a guy who's like, at the time, 16, 17, 18, it was good money. Much better than working like at a fast food restaurant or something like that. And I was keeping all of the money myself, so that made it awesome.
How old were you when you started at Interplay?
I think I was the second oldest person, or maybe the third, and I was 20.
Okay.
Because Brian's like 6 months older than me. And so, we were all pretty young, pretty enthusiastic. And it's one of those things to this day, if somebody's a programmer and wants to become like what I would call top-notch programmer, I would highly recommend being a game programmer while you're young, before you have a spouse, before you have any other obligations, because you will learn more about how a machine really works working at a game company than you will probably in any other industry, because you will become one with the computer. That's the perfect time to do it. Now, if you're married, if you have kids, or if you have any other kind of responsibilities, I do not recommend it, because being at work, typical week for me was at least 60 hours. But you are having so much fun doing it, just pushing the envelope, working with a great group of guys. And now it would be guys and gals, but just working with a great group of people that are all interested in that same thing, that the time flies. It's not like going and, making widgets at a widget factory for 80 hours a week. You're doing this thing that you absolutely love to do, and you're pushing it to the max. You have the best equipment. You're on a team, and the whole team is driven to get this thing done in some amount of time. And you bond with this group of people in a lot of ways more than what you would with your own family, because you're all moving towards that same beat. You love your family, but unless you have a brother or a sister who's a software engineer, what are the odds that you're digging down deep into something? Like, I could guess maybe if you were in a family business, but it was just an awesome time.
Yeah, you were essentially helping to build Interplay at that time. What was Interplay doing in the first years?
The first few years, we were doing games, but we were also doing a lot of ports, a lot of contract software. So believe it or not, Interplay also did some DoD contracts.
That's the Department of Defense, so the military.
We did some educational contracts for the University of California at Irvine. So we were doing a whole bunch of things, everything that was necessary to kind of like keep the lights on, keep things going as we were slowly ramping up, building our own stuff.
What was Interplay like at the time? How many people were you, and what kind of work culture did you have?
I mean, up till the late 80s, there were still just no more than a dozen people. And as the 90s came, Interplay grew kind of big. We kept outgrowing where we were. I mean, our initial offices were in Newport Beach, California, not far from the ocean, which was awesome because there was a few of us that surfed. And we had a shower in the office. So there were a
Nice.
couple of us that we would actually come in the morning, get out of our wetsuit, shower off, throw some jeans on or some shorts and a t-shirt and start coding. And it was awesome. But as we kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there were more and more people, I'll be honest that I was so focused in on the work that a lot of the newer people I didn't tend to know as well as they came along. And it wasn't that I was being aloof or anything. It was just like, are you on the team that's helping me build the thing that I'm working on? No? Okay, well, I've got to get back to what I was doing.
It's interesting because typically the stories that we hear about game teams and new game teams of the era is stories about pizza cartons and full ashtrays and Nerf guns and stuff like that. But I mentioned in my email that we already spoke with Bruce Balfour, and the first thing he remembered about Interplay was that it was typically pretty quiet in the office. Was he right with that?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, I had a tendency to play music while I code. So if you walked by my office, you would usually hear some rock and roll going on. Bruce, he's a great guy and he's a very interesting guy. I actually really enjoyed talking with Bruce just on a not necessarily a work basis, just, hey, this guy is awesome. Let's chat with him. But he came, in my opinion, much later because I was there when it was just myself, Brian, Troy, Jay, and Bill Heineman, now known as Becky Heineman. And that was it. And I mean, there were just these 5 guys. I mean, literally, we could go to lunch in one car. So, and everybody else, I mean, slowly but surely, more people came on as we needed more people. But I mean, it was kind of quiet. I don't think that we had anyone at that time that smoked. We did have a tendency towards later on, especially going to just weirdly extravagant lunches.
Sounds nice.
But I mean, even at that age, I mean, I didn't really drink that much. And it's mainly because we had this saying that you can't code and drink at the same time because you make stupid mistakes. So that wasn't a big thing for us at that time. I tease my kids, who are all adults now, that I didn't start drinking till they were teenagers.
Interplay had initially made a couple of adventure games for Activision and then found success with Bard's Tale.
Yes.
With an RPG, and also with Wasteland. So by the time of Neuromancer, it was kind of an RPG company, I would say.
Right.
And then Neuromancer came out, and it's this hybrid between an adventure game and a role-playing game. I'll tackle that in a minute, but first of all, I'm curious to know how Neuromancer even ended up with Interplay, because at that point, Interplay had only made original games, and now it was a licensed game.
Right. So it's really weird because Neuromancer started off, it was going to be a movie. And there was a production company called the Cabana Boys who were shopping it around. And somehow or another, Dr. Tim Leary got involved and he made the first attempt at doing a game based on Neuromancer. Then somehow, and I don't know how him and Brian knew each other, but him and Brian met each other. And that was how come we say thanks to Tim Leary in the game, was because the rights went to us. Tim Leary was an awesome guy, and I think I kind of freaked him out with my intense nerd boy weirdness and my tendency to speak directly and not have a whole lot of subtleties in my language. Because he kept telling me multiple times that I should be an actor. And I'm like, probably the least person that should be an actor because I wouldn't want to necessarily read the lines. But either way, that was how the rights got to us. So it took a very circuitous route to get back to us with Neuromancer. And I had at that time, and kind of still to this day, have a belief that I don't like violence for the sake of violence. And I felt that so many games that were coming out were really violent. And I always liked the idea of a character, a protagonist that can solve things by thinking his way through a puzzle as opposed to brute strength. Because typically in real life, you're not going to just be able to beat everybody up or shoot everybody to get what you want. That normally doesn't work. And on the other hand, if you think your way through a problem and solve it, that usually does help, and it allows you to keep continuing further. And so both with Neuromancer and later on with Lord of the Rings, I tried to think of puzzles in just scenarios where ideally a character could think their way through this thing and not necessarily have to shoot everybody, and that they could still have fun and enjoy what they were doing.
I see. So Brian Fargo gets the opportunity to create a Neuromancer game. Now, how did that end up on your desk?
I think I was next up in the rotation. Plus, I had a couple of games that came really, really close to kind of getting out there, but never did. Well, not necessarily games, but I should say programs. We did this thing called Software Studios, and Software Studios is still the thing that all these years later, 30-something years later, I still think about sadly, because everybody we showed it to that played around with it loved it. But we just couldn't figure out a way to get it marketed. And so what it was sort of like a cartoon creation program so that you could make these cartoons and they would have text bubbles, and we had all this kinds of animation that you could stitch together. And so you could have multiple characters come into rooms, interact with each other, do certain things. They could dance, they could talk, they could sit, they could sip coffee, and you could make these movies with it. And, at one point we were talking to Disney about it. And this is probably 87. So it's still pretty early in the computer age. And they were actually really interested in it. And then they got worried because it was a little too creative. Like you couldn't stop somebody from doing something that would not be in the nature of Mickey or Minnie.
I see.
And
Okay.
so it was too free formed. And sort of the end result of this stuff is you could create an executable file that you could send to somebody else and they could play it on their computer without necessarily having to own the kit. But they backed out at sort of the last minute and kind of left us hanging there. And that was sort of the end of Software Studios. But its engine was like the bare bones engine for Neuromancer and for later things that I did.
How did you feel about a Software Studio not coming out? That must have been disappointing.
It was definitely very disappointing. It was disappointing to have something that you really liked, other people, everybody that you showed it to really liked. And I actually think multiple times in my head, I think I should do something like that for the web because I still understand how it works. And I understand like, hey, there are lots of people that would love to do. It was a meme generator, but more than a meme generator. It literally could do a whole bunch of different things with the animations that we had canned in there. And especially, it wasn't just me, but like the guys that did the animation, because I'm not an artist. I can draw something and it will kind of look like a guy. Whereas an actual artist will draw something and it looks like a guy. But we were all very disappointed, but it kind of becomes the nature of the beast that you learn to bounce back as quickly as you can and get started on something else and accept this idea. And it's kind of like anything. I almost think I call it the Hollywood attitude that you realize that, okay, this TV show, this movie, this record's not going to come out. However, your head's still full of creativity. So you can do one or two things. You can bemoan the thing that's dead, or you can create something new and move forward. And that's what you kind of do is you move forward. I used to laugh when I first came up into this area and say that I don't think I've ever actually met a waiter or a waitress. I always meet actors.
Since you just mentioned art, there's a small thing that I'd like to ask because I saw that you are credited with art criticism for the 16-bit versions of Borrowed Time. And I wondered, what exactly did that job entail?
There are quite a few of the games where I have a bit of something or else. And you got to understand it, especially at Interplay, we were always firmly tongue-in-cheek a lot of the times. And so there were lots of things where I kind of lended a hand on something because, all of us help each other on the different things. And so somebody would say, well, how do you want to be credited? And I was like, art critic. We did so many things now. And in fact, we were super intense. We had a lot of great ideas. And the thing that I loved about being at Interplay, especially at that time, was that you could tell somebody that their idea wasn't good without them taking it as you saying they're not good. And that is a very difficult level of trust to achieve
Indeed.
with people, that you can say things and say it in such a way that they understand that you're not saying that they're not good, that, hey, this idea, it needs to be worked on some more. It needs to be refined. And I think, especially if you look at the first, dozen or so games that came out of Interplay, I would put them up against the test of time against a dozen games from any other studio that ever did a game, because we were relentless on each other. Everybody had to dog food the game. We offered up criticism, not just me, but everybody, and other people fed back into me. And people would take the things that were said to heart, that, hey, we're just a brotherhood of dudes making games, and we're trying to make the best games.
So you got that assignment to program Neuromancer. What did you start with, or what were the parameters for the game, the framework?
I mean, you got to understand that right now we're living at a time where the games can be better than the thing that you imagine in your head, because the resolution, the processing power, the 3D graphics engines, all this stuff. But back then, the hardest thing when you only had a 320 by 240 screen, 256 colors, was trying to make things look like things. So I already had a graphics engine, and keep in mind that this is just an 8-bit engine that I programmed myself in 6502 assembly. And the idea was that Neuromancer almost had like its own small little mini computer language in it. And it's just written as data stuff. So it's not like a full-fledged language, but it actually does execute code as it's going through. And it's not 6502 code. It's in my little slightly better than assembly language as it's going through and it's chugging through stuff. It can render text out. It can put characters in certain starting positions. It's taking care of their animations. So like when you walk in the bar and he's talking to you, the bubbles that come up and all this stuff like that, these are all part of the engine. And that same engine, and to a slightly better version, lives on in Lord of the Rings as well. And so we knew that we had to do certain things. We wanted to show some parts of the city, some moving around there. We also wanted to show cyberspace. And so cyberspace sort of became this first sort of thing. It's combat, but not really combat. It's more of like acid trip combat because there's all sorts of weird shapes and things and moving across. And so that's kind of where things began. And I also had the pleasure I've gotten to meet William Gibson. In fact, all of us did. And, I was a big fan of the book because I actually had read the book when it came out. So before we had the contract, I had already read it. In fact, both myself and Brian had read the book before we were actually involved in the project.
So back to my question, because what I'm wondering is, what did Brian Fargo tell you in terms of making a Neuromancer game? Did he give you some primers, or did he say, okay, this has to be a role-playing game, or this has to be an adventure game, or here's some notes from Timothy Leary, follow that? What exactly did you get to work with?
Yeah, and in fact, most of that was up to me.
Okay.
And so Brian kind of came back later. Don't get me wrong, in every game Brian's involved. You show him, he wants to see how the progress is going. He definitely has a lot of good feedback because Brian, I would probably say, is one of the best game players and understanders, that I've ever met. Because a lot of people see movies, but there's only a few people that are really good movie critics where they understand the philosophy of the movie. And Brian is that same way with games, where he understands the philosophy of the game. He's played just an immense number of games, and he has very insightful conclusions and criticisms that he draws from different games. Like, like he won't just say that sucked. He'll say, wow, levels 5 through 7, they were amazing. And then when you get to level 8 and it should have been like this peak, it's a complete disappointment and it's a letdown, but it's a letdown because of this, this, and this. Had they did this, they might have hit that high note again. And when you get to level 9, you're like on an upbeat. And those are the things that Brian is an artist about. He's just amazing about that. To this day, he continues to be really, really good with not just saying something's good or bad, but explaining why he thinks it's good or bad and how you can do something to change that sort of trajectory and make the thing better. In a lot of ways, I would compare Brian to like a kinder version of like a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk or somebody like that, where he's really good. He's like the perfect coach. A really good coach gets out of you everything that you actually have in you, where you want to give up and you just want to go, okay, I'm done. This is as good as it's going to get. A really good coach, he knows that you've got a little bit more in there and he gets that little bit more out of you. And this is what makes Brian such an awesome guy, is that this is why so many of our games, at least I think to this day, were just amazing, is that he gets that last little bit and he'll do things that are just, they're cool. They're a little bit on that level I can't quite get to, where like he'll show us games from other companies. He'll show us just this part that he thinks is just awesome. And I remember one time we were watching this hockey game that he was showing us, and I have no interest in hockey, but one of the things that they did was, even though it was just an 8-bit game, it had really huge shapes moving really fast. And he was like, look at how they do that. Imagine if that was a dragon or a spaceship or something else. And I remember he got like 3 of us. We spent like the weekend just playing around with moving really large sprites really fast. And I came up with a way of using the interrupt to give me more sprites, because the C64 had like 8 sprites. But if you multiply them on the interrupt, you can have that one sprite, every height of itself, you could have it replicated, or not replicated, but reused. And that way you can do really big things. And I figured out how to do that. I glued it together, got it to work, and I spent the whole freaking weekend working on this. And mind you, this is like a Southern California springtime where it's like amazing outside. And I sat at home voluntarily all weekend long just because the idea popped into my head and I had to see if I could get it to work.
These days, the gaming industry spends a lot of time talking about crunch. And if I read the manual of Neuromancer, there's a page dedicated to you where you describe the development process and then have a lot of thank yous. And you describe the development process as a long, arduous adventure. You write that you forsook sleep and fun, you work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you pushed yourself to the max, etc. So just reading that, I felt kind of like, oh, that doesn't sound like too much fun. What was that like?
Honestly, it's always a mixed blessing. And I'll be honest about that part, because you push yourself and you just get so sucked into just this one thing. It's hard to see the value of other things that are going on. However, I also believe that one of the reasons why, and this is me tooting my own horn, that I'm still such a good coder, is that I got, during the time of my life when my brain was ready to absorb as much information as it could. And it seems weird that you could relate, hey, here's some 8-bit computers from the 80s to like 64-bit machines that are now. But the key thing always is that you have to understand how the machine works. And so, yeah, it was a very weird time for me, but it was arduous. But at the end, it was always that feeling of elation that unless you've been on one of those journeys, you don't know how it feels, how good it feels that, hey, it's shipped, it's in the store. I still remember the first fan letters I got. I actually got we used to say a groupie, but it was just this one woman wrote to me and was like, oh, like, you're so cute. And I'm like going, apparently you've not been out much. But I mean, we were laughing and joking and having a time. And also, when a project first wrapped up in those days of Interplay, usually there was like a company dinner for everybody that was involved in creating the game, all of their significant other, and the company. And was like whatever restaurant you wanted to go to. There was no limit on like, hey, it's got to be below this much per person. No, whatever restaurant everybody wants to go to. And it was like the company's way of saying thank you to the team, thank you to their spouses for putting up with this crap. Because towards the end, it always gets this way. Always. And I don't care whether it's a game or just a shipping app or something that you're going to do a big release on the internet of a website. Anytime you have to do a whole bunch of stuff, the pressure always builds up. It always feels like, hey, this isn't ever going to end. And then one day you ship it. And ideally, if you did everything right and you start getting those thumbs up, those 5 stars, those, you see those purchase orders coming in from people, that is the most amazing feeling in the world, that you had a part in creating whatever this thing was that you created. In our case, it was games. And I won't lie. I mean, usually back then it was taking us a little over a year to do a game. I mean, now I hear that it's up to like 2 to 3 years on a AAA title. And it's a little bit different for us because we were usually less than a dozen people working on a game. Now there's so many people that people working on the same game don't know each other, because you have one team of people doing 3D graphics, some team programming it, some team doing the writing, you have voice actors, you have all this other stuff going on. And so the team has gotten so big that they don't necessarily all know each other anymore. And that's the part that I would lament the most if I was doing games today. There's something about knowing your team. Ideally, you guys are all like in that same sort of space, working together, chatting about ideas. Now, it's a little bit hard when you're coding, and especially if you're trying to write up stuff yourself, because you need huge chunks of quiet time. I'd call them both the quiet time and crying time, where you're just so frustrated. And that's why I also say that being in your 20s is the best time for this, because you can't do this any other time. This is your peak of healthiness, your peak of like mental acuity. And it's hard to get that much time concentrating once you've become a family person, once you've taken on too much roles of doing other things in life. And it's also good because it sort of comes right around that same time when you're in college and whatever, and you're able to just kind of roll from being in college to being in this game company and still working them same crazy hours. Only now, you, rather than paying for the privilege, you get paid for the privilege. And ideally, you have even better perks.
Early on, you gave this advice to young programmers to do this, as you mentioned, in your early 20s before they have spouses. Now, judging based on the manual where you thank your wife and daughter, you already had a spouse or family even at that point.
Yeah. So at the time, my daughter was just a baby. But I mean, it was definitely a little too much of a load for me then. And it was much better. Well, game programming was, I got to really be careful with the way that I word this. Game programming is better when you're single. Not life is better when you're single. Game programming is better when you're single.
Fair enough. Okay, so, and how did your wife take that back then, you being in the office all the time?
We definitely had a routine, and I had like certain duties that I would do. And so, not mentioned in the manuals and things like that is that on certain days of the week, I would pick up my daughter from daycare, but my wife would normally, like, I would watch the kids, well, kid initially and then later kids, but I would watch the kid during the nighttime because I was usually up coding. And so, like, if the baby was restless, I would go up, get her. If she was needed to be changed, I'd change her. I'd bring her downstairs where my computer and stuff were and just sit her on my lap as I was doing stuff and let my wife sleep.
Okay, so let's jump back to the inception of Neuromancer. You mentioned Brian Fargo, so he basically provided feedback and helped to shape the game.
Right. But a lot of the game, as far as the initial stuff, that was my ideas and my things. And sort of like the first pass of a script for the game was me. Then we had to bring in guys like Bruce Belfort and others where they were much better at the writing. I have a tendency to be exceptionally terse. Not that you can tell from this interview, but, I would say just a few words and it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, but we can't just say 7 words. We got to give them like a monologue, or we got to talk about this and whatever. And so Todd Kamasa was doing a lot of the art, and also I'm forgetting the guy's name, and he is going to kill me later because I do occasionally still see him. But either way, other people were brought in to do a lot of that writing and helping with the writing and making things better.
Are you talking about Michael Stackpole?
Yeah, Michael Stackpole is not the guy that I'm forgetting. I'm forgetting an artist, because Michael Stackpole actually came up in a conversation of mine just a few weeks ago that I was having with a friend, where he was telling me about a Star Wars book that he really, really liked. And I go, which book? And then he tells me, and I looked it up online real quick, and I go, oh, I know Michael Stackpole. And worked together back in the late 80s. And I remember going out to Arizona, which at the time I thought was the hottest place on the surface of the earth, because I went out to Arizona in July.
So that's where Michael Stackpole was living, because he was not working in the office. He was external, essentially.
Right. Michael Stackpole is now and has always been a writer. So he was not like a full-time, sitting in Interplay's offices kind of guy. He always had writing projects that he was working on, and he was just really good. Now, Bruce, for instance, he was super good at being a guy that could juggle things. I think in order to be a producer of anything, whether it's a movie or a game or whatever, you've got to be good at juggling things. And especially when you're dealing with people that are temperamental, like game programmers, artists, writers, you've got to be able to do that cat herding where you tempt people to go the direction that you want them to go, because it's hard to force them.
So was Bruce Balfour then doing project management for Neuromancer?
I mean, that was a lot of what his role was. He was both creative and he was keeping this thing going, because you got to remember, I was the sole software guy. So I'm the only person writing the code at this time. Later on, as we did ports, other people were doing the ports of the game, but I was writing the code, all of the code.
There's one thing that I'd still like to ask you because of this situation with the two writers, Michael Stackpole and Bruce Balfour. I mean, at that point in time, it's pretty unusual to have even one writer on a game. Even today, I think the writers are underappreciated. But you had two. Who contributed what to the game, and how did that work?
I'm going to have to let you trust whatever Bruce Balfour tell you that. I know that both of the guys were writing, and don't get me wrong, I think both of those two guys are awesome. They did an amazing job. To the best of my knowledge, and I'm going to say this, please take this with a grain of salt, I thought that Stackpole was more of the writing guy, because I always think of Bruce as being more of the producer guy, because he was a guy that could, whereas I got like the majority of the credit for the game and whatever, I was so focused in on making sure the game played and that the combat was balanced, that hey, that you can go from point A to point Z in the game and the game wouldn't lock up anywhere on you. Whereas I always considered Bruce to be, now don't get me wrong, he definitely did a lot of the writing. I can definitely remember him doing a lot of writing, but I always thought Stackpole was probably, if I would say it would be like 55-45, Stackpole and Balfour, but that number could have changed over in my head or in reality. But either way, we could not have made the game without either one of them. And also, one of the things about Interplay in general was that, yes, we were more into role-playing probably than anything else, but we always liked the idea of telling a good story. However the game told the story, that was like a big thing with us. And so we knew when we first started out and it was just coders, we knew that we were not like great writers. There's a few exceptions. Michael Cranford, the guy that wrote Bard's Tale, he was actually a really good writer. Good guy, awesome dude, good writer as well. And so most of Bard's Tale he wrote himself, at least the first iterations that came out before the game was actually released. But me, on the other hand, like I said, I still to this day have a more of a technical writer stance on things. I'm really good at explaining to one engineer how to do something. I'm not that good about talking about the colors of a field, of a meadow.
The story, as Bruce tells it and as I've read it on the internet, is that Michael Stackpole was initially assigned as the writer and did the primary treatment and things like that. But then he was preoccupied with Bard's Tale 3 and handed over to Bruce Balfour.
I could see that, definitely. And I'm going to say again, like probably, especially as we kind of got down towards the wire of getting the game out. And one of the things that people sometimes have trouble understanding, and I'm sure you know, is that games were sold in stores then, which meant that there were certain time restrictions. Like if you were trying to get a game out and you were trying to get it out for Christmas, you couldn't get it out on December 24th. You had to have it out like September. You had to be done. And if you missed that September window or October window, whichever it was, that was it. You were screwed. See you next Christmas. And the retailer didn't want anything else to do with you until sometime next year because they knew that most of these kind of things were going to sell during the Christmas season and they didn't want to just hold on to inventory for you. So I was like pretty locked down towards the end of things. And we had tools so that the writers could do stuff without me having to work with them and all that stuff. So
Let's talk a little bit about the design choices for Neuromancer. And I'm curious whether you still remember how they came about, because there's a couple of things about the game which are, let's say, interesting choices. And I'm going to start with the fact that the plot of the game actually has nothing to do with the plot of the novel, or almost nothing. I mean, there are a couple of set pieces, there are locations, and there are a couple of names that pop up. But by and large, it's its own independent thing set in the world of Neuromancer. Why is that?
to the best of my remembrance, there were two reasons for this. And the first was we wanted people who were familiar with the book to still be able to play the game and not know like what was going to happen. And also, I think that there was a little bit, and this is just a little bit, and this is probably mostly between myself and Brian, of worry that we might lose the rights at some point and we might have to rename everything in this game. Um,
I
but the
see.
main part
Okay.
was we definitely wanted it to be its own thing, its own world. And at the time, we definitely thought there was going to be a movie coming out of Neuromancer. We didn't know enough about what was going to go on in the movie or what was going to go on in the book. And so we kind of went our own way. Now, this is mainly the writer's decision on like which way the characters are going to go. I mean, we started off in a bar like the book starts off, and we had a couple of AIs that were from the book as well. But the main thing kind of going on with us was that we wanted this world, and there was some thought that we might even do multiple games in this fashion of like just changing the characters. Because the way the engine was written, the game engine, was that you could theoretically plug in a bunch of different animations, a different set of text, and you had yourself a different game. But the engine would run all that stuff from those set pieces. And that same sort of design decisions even exist in the Lord of the Rings game too, where it's these are the characters from this book, but the adventure that they're on is definitely different than the book. And at the time, it was just the book, and there was like a Bashki animated film, but this is still 10 years before Peter, what's his name, would do the Lord of the Rings trilogy that became the super huge, massive hit. But the idea was that we wanted for people to go off on a different kind of adventure in Neuromancer than what was in the book, just using sort of that. It also is a little bit more Blade Runner-esque, Blade Runner light, because we were huge fans of Blade Runner.
That's interesting that you mention that, because there's another striking distinction between the game and the novel. If you think about the tone of the novel, the atmosphere, it's pretty gritty, it's dystopian, and the same is true for Blade Runner as well. It's a dark movie. However, the game is pretty tongue-in-cheek, actually. You mentioned earlier that that was kind of the spirit of interplay, and my assumption is that maybe it crept into the game because there's quite a lot of humor. It's breaking the fourth wall in some places. All of your names pop up in all of the databases, etc. So it's really interesting. We came into that expecting that dark world of Neuromancer, and then we got something that was much more lighthearted.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say, too, that at 322.40 and 256 colors, it's hard to do gritty. And then when you kind of factor in who our audience was, we're thinking late teens, early 20s. That was sort of our audience range. You don't want to do that gritty of a thing at that time. I do like the tongue in cheek, and you got to remember this is the 80s where Arnold Schwarzenegger kept making movies where he always had a few great one-liners, and I definitely know that that crept into our thoughts because Arnold was then and is still now the man.
Right. Playing the game, it kind of felt like the people who created that wanted to have fun with that world. They probably had fun with that world, and they had fun sneaking all of these little things into there, these little cameos and name droppings, etc.
Yeah, I was always amazed and impressed by the things that the writers came up with, especially Stackpole, but we tended to be a little bit more humorous than possible we should have been. I still don't think of it as a mistake because I like to come away from playing a game smiling. I remember the first time I saw Alien, the first Alien. And it scared the bejesus out of me because I didn't know what to expect. All I knew is my dad said, "Hey, let's go see a movie." And I didn't know what the movie was because I wasn't keeping track of what movies are coming out. And I just remember it was me and my family, my mom and my dad. And my mom was so scared she couldn't sleep for like 3 nights.
Oh.
And I don't want to do that to people. I definitely get like why sometimes that's a good sort of experience and some people really, really like it. They like to be scared. On the other hand, I like to solve puzzles and I tend to laugh and smile a lot. And I kind of want to pass that on to people as opposed to, I mean, think about how we could have went. I mean, you're in a world where people are selling their organs. I
Yeah.
mean, what worse of a nightmare can you have than somebody taking your organs from you and then just leaving you like that? Like, oh, you just took one of my kidneys or whatever. And I think that while we give the player that opportunity to do that, we still keep it weirdly lighthearted and somewhat tongue-in-cheekish that your life has come to this point of you deciding to sell your organs.
Yeah, it felt like you were kind of trying to balance that out. The grittiness of the world and the vibe of the world with that humor and let's say, the storytelling component. For us, it was kind of like the consistency of the game's tone is important. And it didn't need to be scary per se. I don't think Neuromancer is scary, essentially. But it should have been serious, we felt. It was kind of jarring to have that humor in there. And we weren't sure, what's the game trying to achieve? What is it trying to tell us? But anyway.
It was a different time in the 80s.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, and everybody was learning the ropes in terms of adventure game design. Speaking of that, the interface is also something like that. I mean, Neuromancer has an interesting and original interface, a one-of-a-kind interface with these little icons, but also direct control of the character on the screen. If there was a blueprint for adventure games at that time, it was probably the Sierra formula that they had established with King's Quest, but that was still parser-based. Was that ever an option for your game to have it parser-based?
It was something that we thought about, and we decided that for the sort of the mechanics of the gameplay, in order to keep the game moving at a sort of a faster pace, you know, there was a crap ton of adventure games that we played. And in fact, we had friends that worked at almost all the other major game companies. And so we'd swap games with them and they would swap them with us. And the decision that we made was that people don't like typing.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the way that we came up with that sort of pop-up text kind of world of the text comes up and you get your choices of some other text to do. And the game has like multiple different ways that you can still solve things without having to go one for one by picking the best thing at each choice nexus. But we decided that we wanted to kind of minimize the amount of typing that anyone had to do in the game and get that to keep the flow kind of going of one thing to the next and one snarky comment to the next snarky comment.
Fair enough. The game structure is also interesting because it has basically these two parts. The real world part in Chiba City with the streets and you navigate that and solve some puzzles, etc. And then it has the cyberspace part. And the real world part is more adventure-y and cyberspace is more role-play-ish, essentially. But then there's also something in the middle, that Comlink universe, which is more like bulletin board systems. And this was a time before the internet, the World Wide Web, so I guess you did not have any reference point.
Yes, I take credit for inventing the World Wide Web.
Well, thank you very much. We all appreciate it.
And this is sort of I would probably say my computer nerdness showing again, in that there were lots of projects, even in the 80s, trying to do the World Wide Web. And I was kind of up. There was this thing called Project Xanadu. And I actually had read lots of research papers about it and watched a couple of documentaries about it. And so I incorporated that into the PAX system. So there's actually text and links in that world. And theoretically, you could plug all that into a website and have a bunch of websites that you go to that do the same thing. But that was not an accident. I definitely had read up on Xanadu. And so I knew about the World Wide Web, or what would become, because the World Wide Web is actually sort of a watered down version of Project Xanadu. In Neuromancer, it's very, very much watered down just simply because there's only so much you can do in a Commodore 64. Yes, it was a super good computer, but it's still, you've got less than 48K of memory. And at the time, I remember as we were getting close to shipping, that I had one bug left that the testers kept finding. And it became the bug of my nightmares because I had dreams about it, like trying to figure it out. And then one day in a dream, a character says to me, "It's the interrupt, stupid." And I remember writing that down. And when I got into the office, that was the bug. So on a 6502, really super primitive processor, but in a lot of ways, kind of like a RISC machine, I would use the interrupt to do things in sort of a multitasking framework. And so what was happening was one of my interrupts was occurring and it was blasting the stack frame that was causing it. And it wasn't every time, it was doing it like one time in 10,000. So it could take hours of playing and then this bug would occur and it would crash. But that was what the bug was. And so I found the bug, fixed the bug, and we were good to ship.
Well done. I mean, the game is a lot about hackers, the cyber cowboys, as they're called in the Neuromancer world, and they are conversing with each other in bulletin boards with messages, kind of something like emails would be an analog today. Were you involved in the bulletin board world of that era, or maybe even in the hacker world?
Definitely involved in bulletin boards. So there was quite a few people, and it was such a weirdly strange time just because you had your 1200 baud modem where you hear it go, and then it would slowly start spitting out some text. God help you if you tried to send an image of something to somebody or you were downloading it from a bulletin board. But yeah, I definitely, not as much as I would like to have, because in the sort of like the early days when I first got my modem and things like that, and that time I think I had an Apple II with the modem. I remember spending 200 something plus dollars for another 4K of RAM or 16K of RAM to get me up to like 32K of RAM. And so everything was really expensive. Everything was really slow. In order to go on a bulletin board, you needed to know the name of that bulletin board. There was no yellow pages of here's some interesting bulletin boards. Usually you went to one bulletin board, it would have some other bulletin boards that it thought was interesting. And you would occasionally meet people at like computer shows and user groups and stuff like that. And they go, "Oh yeah, here's a bulletin board. Just dial this, go to this number here." He's usually on from like 9 p.m. till 6 a.m. because a lot of the bulletin boards, they were on somebody's personal phone, on their actual wired up phone. And so it's very rare to find a bulletin board where the person had a dedicated line. They would turn it on when their parents went to sleep. It was a very crazy time. And so quickly, I knew more than all of them knew. And in fact, a lot of the user groups that I was aware of in both Orange County and San Diego County in California, they were constantly wanting me to come in and chat with people because I was actually writing code as opposed to wanting to write code. My biggest secret then was I learned to write manufacturers of different processors. Like I had the 8086 programming manual, the CMOS or the MOS Technology 6502 programming manuals. And what was great, and this is amazing to me to this day, you would write somebody a letter, some company, and say you need the programmer's guide for this, and they would send you a book for free. Here's a book. Here's a nicely bound book. Sometimes it was like 3 whole things, and other times it was a bound book, but they would send it to you for free. And you're just like, wow, this is awesome. Life is good.
So one or two more things about Neuromancer. I already mentioned cyberspace. Now, of course, that's a big part of the game. And I don't think the book gives you much to go on in terms of what cyberspace looks like or feels like. And I think Neuromancer does a pretty good job of creating a cyberspace that is consistent and makes sense. But it's primarily defined by role-playing game mechanics. And I don't think that's an obvious choice. So we were wondering why the role-playing element came into play in the game.
Quite honestly, I will confess to being a D&D player back in high school. And those kind of mechanisms work out well for me in my head. And in fact, a lot of the way that I will template things is that I will grab some dice and assign different powers and actually roll through either that or I will sometimes use a deck of cards. And so there are certain things in some games that I've done, and I won't say which ones, where if you started assigning cards, colors, and suites and values, that's the mechanisms that I'm actually using underneath the sheets of how I make this thing work. Because somehow you have to like make sure that you've made the game balanced. And balancing off a game can be a little bit less than obvious of how to do it so that it's fair. And also the other word that you use, consistent, that there's certain things that are going on. And so that if you acquire a piece of technology that's supposed to boost your level to do this, that we stay within those rules of the game. And so that was kind of the thing. And quite honestly, it's also because at its heart, that's what interplay is. We're mostly role playing.
Okay.
And all of us are familiar with those mechanisms, and we have good ways of sort of testing things out, because what we don't want to have happen is that, and I've had this happen in games that I've played, where you get to a certain level and for the life of you, you cannot beat this character. You get there and it's like, you think you know what to do, and you get there and you can't beat them. And then if you're like me, you might start off all over again. Like you missed something somewhere along the line, you missed something, and let's start all the way back at the beginning and work our way through. So that's sort of the way that we do it, is that in the heart of how we're doing things is that everything kind of comes down to a role-playing thing.
Okay, so you wanted to make a role-playing game or give that role-playing aspect to the game.
Yeah, that part of it, yes.
Okay. At that point, Interplay had gotten well known for making role-playing games, and we kind of assumed that players also expected a role-playing experience from Interplay, or that you maybe assumed that players would expect a role-playing experience, and that's why Neuromancer is this hybrid of adventure and role-playing game.
Yeah.
Okay. So all in all, Troy, how happy are you with Neuromancer?
I really do like the way that it came out. We did win some accolades, and I like the fact that people appreciated that it was different than a lot of the other games that were out there. And kind of the same experience that I had with Lord of the Rings, 2 years later after that, it was different than what people thought. And I appreciate the fact that the universe of games doesn't all have to be just one version of this or that, or that there was like an appreciation just for the difference. And also, there was just a crew of guys that I think of fondly to this day. Yeah, it was definitely an immense amount of work, but it was super fun. I still have my game of the year somewhere in here in my other room.
And why, if you don't mind me asking, why did you leave Interplay?
I mean, for me, there was the end of Interplay and sort of the end of my marriage kind of came all in the same time. And I realized that I was just burnt out, and I was going through a divorce, and I wanted to do something where I could work 9 to 5. So leaving Interplay was really weird. I got a big boost in salary, and I worked less hours. And I worked someplace where I was showing them how to do stuff. I remember I was working at this hardware maker, and I showed them how to emulate a microprocessor, and they had no idea how to do it in software. And the thing that made it nice is that I wrote like a whole emulator for their hardware. They made these computerized scales, and I emulated the whole device on a PC, and they were blown away. I was now the rock star developer of the whole company, because until that time, what they would do is they would burn a ROM, stick it in the machine, see if that worked. And then I showed them that, no, you could just run the software in the emulator on the PC and see if it worked. And so suddenly their time cycles went down from minutes to seconds. And then I got it down even further than that. But it was definitely an interesting time. But my departure from Interplay was quite a while after Lord of the Rings. And there's also just a time where, you love people like you love your parent. But there's a point where you go, it's time for me to get my own apartment.
Yeah, I can completely relate. I mean, I'm not a programmer, but I started as a games journalist when I was a young man, about the same age when you entered Interplay. And the first, 10 years with that publishing house were intense, more or less the same way that you described, with working long hours deep into the night, on the weekends, etc. And I wouldn't want to miss it. It was a great time, but at some point it was time to move on. I couldn't see myself as a person testing video games when I was 40 or 50 or something like that.
Well, you'll find this one small little snippet that I'll tell you. It's like right now I've decided to start doing games again. So I've been playing around with some game engines, trying to decide what game engine to go with, because I'm playing around mostly with Unity and also one called Godot. And then I'm going to start doing games, but not so much to make money. I'm going to write a book on how to make games using one of these game engines for people that want to learn how to do games. And hopefully I'm going to be done with the book, hopefully next summer, I'm thinking. because I've just started. I've got a bunch of game ideas. Like some of them are 8-bit, some of them are a little bit more graphic game engine-y, more like Neuromancer, less like Bard's Tale type games. Because I don't ever see anybody showing that kind of game. They usually have like what I call the 8-bit 2D world, and then you've got the 3D world type things. But you don't have too many adventure games where somebody shows you how do you write one of these games.
Well, that sounds like a great endeavor. Let us know when you finish the book. We also have a newsletter and a listener community, of course, so we will gladly promote it, let our listeners know that the book is out there. I'm sure there are some that would be interested in that.
Oh, awesome.
And also at some point in the future, we might tackle the Lord of the Rings game. Can we hit you up again if we get to that?
Oh, absolutely. Now that you know how to get in contact with me, I always laugh that I'm the easiest person on the internet to find, but the hardest to reach. It's not intentional. It's just that, like, right now, I get a lot of emails from people that took my LinkedIn courses. And so I'm kind of like going through those. And then I go through some emails. And I always tell people, whatever you do, if you're trying to reach me in an email, you need to say something that makes you sound not like some spam. And I actually did see your letter when you guys sent it. And I kind of like flagged it, and then I totally forgot about it because I went on vacation like right afterwards. And if you hadn't have caught me this week, it would have been like next week I'll be at AWS reInvent in Vegas for a week. And I won't remember anything after that except for AWS stuff and who had the best party.
Right. Well, I'm really glad that we got through to you and had the opportunity to talk to you. This was very insightful. So, Troy, thank you very much for taking the time.
All right. Well, you're welcome, and it's been a pleasure. You take care.
So, also, das war das englischsprachige Interview von Chris mit Troy Miles, dem Mann, der den Top-Credit im Titelbildschirm von Neuromancer hat, also der Kopf hinter dem Spiel ist. Er war schon als Teenager Spieleentwickler, erzählte er, aber nicht bei einer Firma. Er hat im Wesentlichen Kopien von Arcade-Games für Commodore und Apple II gemacht und die an lokale Läden in seiner Heimatstadt verkauft. Er kannte Brian Fargo von einer Gameshow und blieb dann mit ihm in Kontakt. 1984 lud Fargo ihn dann ein, bei seiner neuen Firma Interplay zu arbeiten. Da war er dann der zweitälteste Mitarbeiter, obwohl er nur 20 Jahre alt war. Fargo war auch nur 6 Monate älter. Interplay hat am Anfang dann Auftragsarbeiten gemacht, Portierungen, sogar Aufträge für die Universität in Irvine und das Verteidigungsministerium. Und derweil haben sie angefangen, langsam ihre eigenen Sachen zu bauen. Sie wollten ja eigene Spiele machen. Bis Ende der 80er war das ein Dutzend Leute, erzählt Troy. Die saßen in Newport in der Nähe des Meeres. Es war nicht unüblich, morgens noch surfen zu gehen. Anfang der 90er ist die Firma dann rasant gewachsen und viel größer geworden. Christian fragte ihn dann ein bisschen was zur Firmenkultur, hat ein bisschen die Klischees abgefragt. Ne? Ist es da auch so mit Pizzakartons und überquellende Aschenbecher und laute Musik so gewesen? Aber Troy meinte, nee, das war keine richtig laute Firma. Also er hätte schon Rock'n'Roll gehört, aber so laut war es insgesamt nicht. Und eigentlich hätte niemand geraucht. Aber sie gingen extravagant essen. Auch Alkohol sei kein großes Thema gewesen, denn wer trinkt, macht Fehler beim Coden. Der erste Erfolg der Firma war Bard's Tale und dann kam Wasteland und als Neuromancer kam, da war die Firma eigentlich schon eine Rollenspielfirma. Vorher haben sie schon auch Adventures gemacht. Neuromancer war das erste Lizenzgame und Christian hat dann gefragt, wie es dazu kam. Troy hat die Geschichte schon noch im Kopf. Er war eine wichtige Quelle für die Hauptfolge, die wir zu Neuromancer gemacht haben. Für Interplay begann es mit dem Kontakt von Brian Fargo zu Timothy Leary, der die Rechte hatte und sie an Interplay weitergab. Kurios ist, wie Troy beschreibt, dass er glaube, er habe den Leary schwer irritiert mit seiner Nerdboy-Weirdness, also vielleicht seiner Außenseiter-Schrägheit und seiner Art, ganz direkte Ansagen zu machen. Leary hatte ihm wohl gesagt, er soll aber Schauspieler werden, aber Troy hält sich gerade für das Gegenteil. Troy erzählt auch, dass er keine Gewalt mag, um der Gewalt willen. Viele Spiele sind ihm zu gewalttätig. Er findet Spiele, in denen die Protagonisten durch Denken zur Lösung kommen müssen, besser. Und meint auch, im richtigen Leben sei das ja nun auch so. Ja? Die meisten Probleme sind besser durch Denken lösbar als durch Schlagen oder Schießen. Christian hat ihn dann gefragt, wie das Spiel zu ihm kam. Und er meinte ein bisschen, er sei einfach dran gewesen. Ja, er nennt das in der Rotation. Der Programmierer kam das Spiel so einfach zu ihm. Er war zu der Zeit mit einer anderen Sache fast fertig. Er hat zu der Zeit Software Studio gemacht, ein Projekt, das aber nie erschienen ist. Das war so eine Art Cartoon-Baukasten. Man konnte so Charaktere erzeugen, mit Animationen versehen und damit so kleine Filme machen. Sie wollten das an Disney verkaufen, aber Disney war das angeblich zu frei, weil man damit die Charaktere alles Mögliche anstellen lassen konnte. Ja, dann könnte ja vielleicht Donald auch was Unanständiges machen oder so. Und die haben es dann abgesagt, aber die Engine wurde zur Grundlage für Neuromancer. Troy hat da lange drüber gesprochen. Er ist auch heute noch traurig darüber, dass aus dem Studio nichts geworden ist. Alle mochten das. Er hat das für ein tolles Projekt gehalten. Und er hat sogar überlegt, das nochmal fürs Web jetzt neu zu machen als eine Art Meme-Generator und noch ein bisschen mehr. Chris fragt ihn dann nach einem Credit in dem Spiel Borrow Time. Da ist er nämlich aufgeführt im Handbuch für Art Criticism. Und da hat Chris gefragt, wie das zustande kam. Troy meint, das sei üblich gewesen, dass sie sich alle bei Projekten ausgeholfen haben und dann gefragt wurden, wie sie dafür im Handbuch erwähnt werden wollten. Und da passt es wohl in die Stimmung, da auch Witzchen zuzumachen. Also hat Troy bestanden auf dem Credit als Kunstkritiker. Er beschreibt die ganze Atmosphäre als sehr zusammenarbeitend und offen für konstruktive Kritik. Es war sehr leicht möglich, anderen Leuten zu sagen, dass eine Idee nicht gut ist, weil das nicht als Kritik an der Person verstanden worden ist, sondern halt als wirklich nur Kritik an der Idee. Und alle haben alle Spiele ausprobiert und waren sehr interessiert, als Gruppe das jeweilig bestmögliche Spiel zu machen. Er nennt diese Gruppe eine Brotherhood of Dudes, vielleicht eine Bruderschaft von Typen. Und er meint, die ersten 12 Spiele von Interplay, die so entstanden sind in dieser spezifischen Atmosphäre, die können sich mit den ersten 12 Spielen jeder anderen Firma messen. Naja, und dann spricht er noch ein bisschen über die Entwicklung von Neuromancer. Er hatte diese selbstgeschriebene 8-Bit-Engine halt aus dem Software Studio und sie wussten schon ungefähr, was sie wollten. Sie wollten eine begehbare Stadt, sie wollten Kampf, aber also keinen richtigen Kampf im Sinne von Gewehren und sowas oder Pistolen. Sie wollten so einen Acid-Trip-Kampf, wie er das nennt, also irgendwas im Cyberspace. Und sie wollten natürlich einen Cyberspace. Er hat auch Neuromancer gelesen, das Buch vorher schon, kannte das schon und hat ein bisschen stolz erwähnt, dass er William Gibson kennengelernt hat und gesprochen hat im Rahmen dieser Entwicklung. Christian fragt dann nach Vorgaben. Und er sagt, nee, er sei eigentlich ziemlich frei gewesen. Also Brian Fargo war natürlich da und hat Feedback gegeben und Einfluss gehabt. Aber Troy sagt, die Ideen wären schon grundsätzlich alle von ihm gekommen. Er erzählt dann, dass Fargo einer der besten Spieleversteher sei und konnte sehr gut strukturelles Feedback geben. Eine freundlichere Version von Steve Jobs nennt er das. Ein perfekter Trainer, der alles aus dir rausholt. Und man kann sich gut vorstellen, wie das Spiel entstanden ist mit einem Mentor im Hintergrund und den Leuten, die dann daran direkt gearbeitet haben. Chris fragt dann nach Crunch, also nach so Doppelschichten und harter Arbeit, wie sie in Endphasen von Spieleentwicklungen oft sind, weil Troy im Handbuch darauf ein bisschen rekurriert hat vom Stress von der Entwicklung erzählt. Und Troy gibt schon zu, dass es Zeiten gab, da konnte er den Wert von anderen Sachen außer Arbeit nicht sehen, aber er will die Zeit nicht missen. Er glaubt auch, dass er deswegen ein so guter Programmierer ist, wegen der intensiven Arbeit damals. Er geht da ziemlich ins Detail und macht das auch ziemlich deutlich, dass er das eigentlich ziemlich super fand. Er war halt in diesem Alter, wo man auf dem Höhepunkt seiner Leistungsfähigkeit ist, halt so Anfang 20. Man hat da oft noch keinen Partner, man hat noch keine großen Verpflichtungen als Familienmensch oder sonst irgendwas. Man kann sich da voll in diese Sache fallen lassen und mit so Gleichgesinnten arbeiten. Das hat ihn schon sehr begeistert. Und er erzählte, am Ende einer Entwicklung gab es halt immer so ein High, wenn das Spiel in den Laden kommt. Und es gab so ein großes Abendessen für das Team und die Partner, so ein Dankeschön der Firma. Aber er glaubt auch grundsätzlich ist dieses eine Sache fertig machen und dann vor Leute bringen, ob das jetzt ein Spiel ist oder was anderes, das ist halt ein großes Gefühl. Und er beschreibt auch, dass es vielleicht auch daran gelegen hätte, dass es so kleine Gruppen waren, in denen man sich gut kannte. Ja, die waren ja dann so in der ganzen Firma zu der Zeit noch so 10, 12 Leute. Heute arbeiten Leute in gigantischen Teams an Spielen und kennen sich untereinander gar nicht. Das bedauert Troy. Und da findet er schon, dass das nicht so eine anstrebenswerte Vision ist vom Spielemachen. Chris sagt dann, dass er nun schon aber gar nicht in dieses Bild passt von dem Anfang 20 total fokussierten Solo-Coder, weil er schon zu der Zeit ein Kind hatte und eine Frau. Das ist im Handbuch auch erwähnt. Und das passt ja nicht so ganz zu seiner vehementen Verteidigung der intensiven Arbeit. Er beschreibt dann, dass sie ein gutes Arrangement hatten, er und seine Frau, und dass er auch oft dann teilgenommen hat an der Kinderpflege, indem er die Nächte in der Tendenz übernommen hat, weil er oft nachts noch spät gearbeitet hat und dann halt das Kind betreut hat, damit seine Frau schlafen konnte. Aber wie wir am Ende des Interviews noch hören werden, ist seine Ehe ja auch geschieden worden und er ist von der Arbeit bei Interplay ausgebrannt. Also das ist vielleicht auch ein bisschen eine leichte Beschönigung der Sachen. Sie kommen dann wieder im Gespräch zurück auf die Entwicklung. Zur Unterstützung kam dann, als feststand, dass er das macht, als Programmierer noch Grafiker dazu und Schreiber. Also Michael Stackpole war dann freier Texter, Bruce Balfour kam dazu, von dem wir ja auch ein Interview haben, in so einer Rolle, die man vielleicht als Projektmanager oder Producer beschreiben kann. Aber Troy war der einzige Softwaremensch, der einzige Programmierer. Der Stackpole hat die meisten Texte geschrieben, laut Troy mindestens 55%. Bruce Balfour hat dann den Rest geschrieben. Und er sagt, ja, auch wenn Interplay eine Rollenspielfirma ist, eine gute Geschichte war ihnen immer wichtig. Der Troy hat dazu nicht beigetragen zum Schreiben. Er sagt, er sei ein guter Erklärer von technischen Dingen, aber schon wenn er Farben beschreiben soll, also die Farbe eines Feldes oder so, dann setzt das schon aus. Michael Cranford, der Programmierer von Bard's Tale, sei da anders gewesen, der konnte auch schreiben. Aber Troy war als Programmierer zu wichtig, auch in der Endphase des Spiels vor allem, weil ja Spiele, die zum bestimmten Zeitpunkt im Laden stehen müssen, halt schon weit vorher fertig werden müssen und dann ist man als Programmierer zu beschäftigt. Chris fragt dann, warum der Plot des Spiels nichts mit dem Buch zu tun hat. Das ist ja eine Sache, die uns sehr beschäftigt hat. Und darauf sagt Troy, dass sie wollten, dass Leute, die das Buch kennen, sich nicht langweilen. Außerdem dachten sie, es könnte sein, dass sie die Lizenz verlieren und dann wollten sie in der Lage sein, einfach die Namen und Orte zu ändern und wollten das Spiel nicht einstellen müssen. Außerdem sollte noch ein Film rauskommen, das dachten sie damals ja, und dann sollte das Spiel irgendwie alleine stehen können, neben diesem Buch und dem Film und nicht einfach nur so ein Abklatsch von einem der beiden sein. Sie waren überzeugt von dem Ansatz, sie hatten sogar überlegt, in der Welt mehrere Spiele anzusiedeln. Und er sagt auch, sie wären große Fans von Blade Runner gewesen und davon so ein bisschen inspiriert. Da hakt dann Chris ein und fragt die, haha, aber wenn das Buch so düster ist und ihr von Blade Runner inspiriert wart, was ja auch düster ist, warum ist dann das Spiel so lustig? Warum durchbricht das Spiel die vierte Wand und ist nicht dunkel und böse und gemein? Und darauf sagt Troy entwaffnend, naja, mit 256 Farben ist es schon ein bisschen schwierig, eine dreckige, realistische Welt darzustellen. Und ihre Zielgruppe seien halt so Anfang 20er gewesen, End-Teenager. Da fanden sie damals düster nicht angemessen. Das waren ja auch die 80er. Er will auch eigentlich gar keine düsteren Spiele machen. Er steht nicht auf Horror und dunklen Realismus. Er will, dass Leute lächeln. Chris kommt dann mit den Fragen zum Interface. Das Neuromancer hat ja ein einzigartiges Interface, was keinem anderen Spiel so richtig ähnelt. Damals gab es auch für Adventures noch keine festen Konventionen. Wenn es eine Formel gab, dann war es vielleicht die der Sierra-Spiele mit direkter Kontrolle und Textparser. Und ob das auch für Neuromancer nicht vielleicht eine Option gewesen wäre. Und er sagt, sie haben darüber nachgedacht, das war schon eine der Ideen. Aber eine ihrer Erkenntnisse war, Leute tippen nicht gern. Und sie haben versucht, alles, wo man Text eintippen muss, das gibt es ja im Spiel durchaus, zu vermeiden, also oder zu reduzieren, damit der Flow nicht gestört wird. Dann kommen sie drauf, dass das Spiel ja mehrere unterschiedliche Ebenen hat. Den Cyberspace natürlich, die Stadt, in der die Figur rumläuft und aber auch dieses quasi Internet im Spiel, dieses Pack-System, wo man da sich so in so eine Art Mailbox-System bewegt. Und Troy sagt darauf scherzhaft, dass man ihm ja wohl die Erfindung des World Wide Web zu verdanken habe. Er hätte viel über das erste Hyperlink-Projekt, Project Xanadu, gelesen damals und war wohl auch generell auf der Höhe der Zeit zu seiner Zeit in den 80ern, was in Sachen Internet passierte. Und er hätte das einfließen lassen. Und er sei auch in Mailboxen unterwegs gewesen mit einem Apple II-Modem. Chris fragt noch nach den Rollenspielanteilen des Spiels. Warum ist das nicht ein reines Adventure? Wie kamen die Rollenspielanteile da rein? Und Troy sagt, naja, gut, die Firma ist halt eine Rollenspielfirma. Das ist das, was sie kennen und was sie verstehen. Und er sei D&D-Spieler und würde halt viele Dinge durch die Linse des D&D-Spielers sehen, des Rollenspielers sehen. Und das hätte ihnen schon so gepasst. Chris fragt dann, wie er das Spiel eigentlich findet, also wie ihm das Spiel gefallen hat, dem Troy in der Rückschau. Und er sagt, ja, er mag, wie es geworden ist. Viele Leute mochten es, weil es anders ist. Hat damit seinen Frieden gemacht oder findet es gut genug. Dann kommen sie noch drauf, warum er Interplay verlassen hat. Und das habe ich vorhin schon kurz angedeutet. Er war halt ausgebrannt, seine Ehe war in Scheidung. Und dann sagte er wollte irgendwas haben, wo er jetzt von 9 bis 5 hingehen kann und fertig. Und hatte ein bisschen wohl die Schnauze voll dann von der intensiven Arbeit. Hat dann auch mehr Geld verdient und offenkundig einen leichteren Job gehabt danach. Aber die Spiele haben ihn nicht so richtig losgelassen. Jetzt gerade, zum Zeitpunkt des Interviews, programmiert er wieder, probiert Engines aus, also Game Engines aus, Unity und so, und will vielleicht ein Buch schreiben über Spieleentwicklung, über Adventure-Entwicklung. Da schauen wir mal. Chris hat gesagt, wenn er fertig ist, dann soll er mal Bescheid sagen. So, dann vielen Dank fürs Zuhören euch.